Okay, so good evening, everyone. Again, I'm Moelius, security engineer at Trilobits, and this talk is on detecting transaction displacement attacks with Manticore. I want to re-emphasize what Anna said earlier. You are welcome to unmute yourself and interrupt me with questions if you like. Okay, so a transaction displacement attack is an attack that one would carry out on the Ethereum network, and it is specifically where an attacker replaces a legitimate transaction with one of their own. And they might do this, say, to steal something of value that was intended for the legitimate transaction sender. This term comes from this paper, Transparent Dishonesty, Front-Running Attacks on Blockchain. And that paper distinguishes displacement attacks from two other types of what they call front-running attacks, what others might call transaction reordering attacks. But the thing that distinguishes a displacement attack is that it is not important that the original legitimate transaction run after the fraudulent transaction. The other two types of attacks that they describe in that paper are insertion and suppression. But for the purpose of this talk, we're going to focus on displacement attacks. So that paper gives three examples of displacement attacks. So the first is Alice is trying to register a domain, and Mallory swoops in and registers that domain first. Second example is Alice is trying to submit a bug report to receive some reward, and Mallory interjects and submits that bug report first in order to receive the reward. And the third example is Alice is trying to bid in an auction, and Mallory goes ahead and submits the same bid ahead of time, thereby forcing Alice to bid higher. Okay, so I'm going to maintain a kind of running example throughout this talk. It is not identical to the second case, but it is most similar in spirit to the second case. And that running example is this. So as you may well know, in Ethereum, an address is the hash of a public key, an elliptic curve point. So suppose that for whatever reason, I want to know the public key, the point that corresponds to some particular address. So I might outsource that problem, the problem of finding that point, with a contract like I've depicted here. So if you, through whatever means, are able to recover the point corresponding to the address that I'm interested in, you can go ahead and call this function submit with that point, and what the contract will do is it will verify that, that the contract's reward has not already been redeemed. It'll verify that the point you provided really does correspond to the address that I'm interested in. It'll then mark the contract as redeemed, and it will transfer the balance of the contract to you as the sender. Okay, so this contract is pretty simple by Ethereum standards, but it's actually overly simple in that it is susceptible to a transaction displacement attack. And the flaw is actually in the design of its API. All right, so I'm going to walk through this in some detail. So let's recall a few facts about how Ethereum works. So think of this cloud on the slide as the Ethereum network, and it has participants, Alice, Bob, and Charlie, and it also has miners. Our miner here is named Mallory, and Mallory, of course, is one of the, as a miner, she's going to propose blocks to be included into the blockchain. So our participants, Alice, Bob, and Charlie, are going to broadcast transactions to the network. So Alice might broadcast that she wants to send 10 ETH to Bob. Bob might broadcast that he wants to call function foo on contract Baz. And Charlie, perhaps Charlie, through some means, has recovered the public key corresponding to the address that I'm interested in. So he wants to call submit on address bounty in order to obtain the corresponding reward. So our miner is going to listen in on the network and start to construct a block. Okay, so in this block, she's going to include the transactions that she observes on the network. And each of these transactions could succeed or it could revert. And there's different reasons why a transaction might revert. But so say she chooses to include Alice's transaction and Alice's transaction succeeds. Maybe for Bob's transaction, maybe the contract Baz doesn't have a method foo. And for this reason, Bob's transaction reverts, say. All right, now when Mallory comes to Charlie's transaction, she might notice that Charlie is going to receive a nice payout from submitting this transaction. She might also notice that she could just as well submit that transaction herself. So what she could do then is take the data in Charlie's transaction and re-sign it as though it came from her, and then include that re-signed transaction in her block, and in doing so, obtain the rewards for herself. Now, in Ethereum, miners collect fees in the form of gas for, they collect these from users of the network by including those users' transactions in their block. So just to add insult to injury, Mallory might still include Charlie's transaction in her block just to collect his fees. But now that the reward has already been collected, Charlie's transaction will revert and he will not collect the reward. Okay. All right, so that's how a transaction displacement attack would apply to this address bounty contract that I presented earlier. So how would we address this problem? How do you design a contract to not be susceptible to these attacks? So a common way is to use a commit reveal scheme. So with a commit reveal scheme, there would not be just one call submit. Instead, a sender would call two functions, commit followed by reveal. And what the contract would do is it would verify that these two calls were separated by some number n of blocks. It would verify that the value z, which was committed to, is the hash of x and y and the sender's address. And then the same conditions as before would have to hold. The contract would have to have not already been redeemed, and it would have to, the x and y would have to correspond to the address that was of interest. So how does this help? Well, suppose that Mallory were to try to blindly copy Charlie's calls. Well, the value that Charlie commits to here will be the hash of x and y and Charlie's address. So if Mallory then later calls reveal, having previously committed to the same value that Charlie committed to, then what the contract will try to verify is that z is the hash of x and y and Mallory's address. And of course, that check will fail. So Mallory blindly copying Charlie's calls will do her no good. And that is how a scheme like this helps to defend against transaction displacement attacks. This is still attackable, but the bar to attacking it is significantly higher than attacking a contract that has no commit reveal scheme. So that's how we defend against it. How do we detect these sorts of attacks? So I want to point out that if you go back to the examples that were given in that paper, you'll notice that if you were to execute the legitimate transaction after the fraudulent one, you would expect the legitimate transaction to revert. So for example, if Mallory were to already register a domain name and Alice were to subsequently try to register the same name, you would expect Alice's transaction to revert with a message like domain name already registered. Similarly, in the second case, if Mallory has already submitted that bug report, you would expect Alice's transaction to fail with a message like bug report already submitted. And in the last case, if Alice were to try to submit a bid of the same value as what Mallory submit, you would expect a error message defective. Bid must be higher than current bid, something to that effect. All right, and just to help to drive this point home, this property is also exhibited by the contract I showed you earlier. In the fact that the reward could only be given out once. Now, I want to be clear, I designed it to have this property, but this contract has that property just the same. And so we can use this property to try to detect contracts that are susceptible to transaction displacement attacks. And we're going to do so using Manticore. So I'm now going to say a few words about what Manticore is. So Manticore is trail of bits symbolic execution tool. It can analyze Ethereum smart contracts, Linux self-binaries, and WASM modules. But for the purpose of this talk, we're just going to focus on Ethereum smart contracts. So I'm going to show you a few slides in order to explain how Manticore works. Each of these slides will have a diagram where a circle represents a state of the blockchain, and an arrow between circles represents a transaction to some contract. And of course, each of these transactions could succeed or revert. So the way that you would typically use Manticore is you would deploy some number of contracts to its internal blockchain. And then you would have Manticore generate symbolic transactions against one or more of those contracts. So Manticore will then systematically generate the search tree, generating transactions against those various contracts. So that's what Manticore does just out of the box. So here's the part where I describe what is new. All right, so suppose that at some point in the search, we encounter a transaction that succeeds. So any transaction that succeeds. So I'm going to give this transaction here a name U just to make it easier to refer to. When we encounter such a situation, what we're going to do is roll Manticore back to the state it was in just prior to the execution of that transaction. What we're then going to do is start executing new symbolic transactions from that point. Now, we, of course, expect U to succeed because when U was executed from this point here, it was successful. But if we ever encounter a situation where U fails, where it reverts, that's of interest to us. That's considered a win. So since this is sort of the crux of the idea, I just want to really drive this home. So we expected U to succeed because when it was executed from this point, it was successful. But Manticore, through symbolic execution, was able to generate another transaction such that when that transaction preceded U reverted, and that, of course, is of interest. All right, so that's the idea. So we've implemented this idea in a detector called detect transaction displacement. And what I have here is a Python script just to give you the flavor of how you use this. So this script is pretty simple. What I've done is I've taken an address and a public key from a blog post due to Vincent Coble. And all the script does is deploy the contract with the target address and then call this function submit with that public key. And of course, this call is going to succeed because this public key really does correspond to this address. All right, so all the magic happens in this line right here. And the reason why is because in Manticore, the way detectors work is they register themselves to be executed at different points in Manticore's execution. So for example, this detector registers itself to run before and after every transaction. And so it runs after this transaction, observes that it was successful, then rolls Manticore back to that earlier state and proceeds to perform the symbolic exploration like I described in the previous slides. So the way that Manticore works is Manticore will produce a directory, and within that directory will be various files. Some of those files will be TX files. You can think of these as transcripts of a path taken through that search tree. So in this particular experiment, the relevant transcript happens to be user_005.tx. And if you look at this file, you can see here two identical calls to submit with the same arguments. The first one is successful, but the second one reverts. Moreover, if you look at the return data in the second call to submit, you can even see that the error message that was returned was already redeemed, as we would expect. Okay. Okay, so what are some of the limitations to this technique? So number one, it is tremendously expensive. So adding these additional symbolic searches at each layer of the search tree is significantly expensive, and it significantly increases the runtime. That's perhaps the most significant drawback. There are many ways that you can get false negatives. Okay, so first, not every transaction displacement attack will have this property that when a legitimate transaction follows the fraudulent one, the legitimate transaction will revert. We're using this property as a kind of proxy to identify transaction displacement attacks, but not all susceptible contracts are going to have this property. All right. Second, Manticore's search is not guaranteed to be exhaustive. So this is not a flaw of Manticore so much as it is a flaw of symbolic execution. So this was somewhat alluded to in the previous talk. It would be unreasonable to expect a symbolic execution tool to be exhaustive in its search without significant human guidance. And we want this to be as push button and as easy to use as possible. Third, if your contract involves hard computational problems, like say inverting a hash function in the address boundary contract I showed you, then you pretty much have to provide a successful transaction as an exemplar. The alternative is to ask a solver to try to find inputs to the relevant function in order to witness a successful transaction. And for something like inverting a hash function, that's just not going to happen. And last but not least, for the specific case where the transaction U is a create, we ignore it. Now, the reason for this is simply because we consider it unlikely that a contract is going to be susceptible to a transaction displacement attack in regard to a create in the real world. So this is a kind of informed decision that we make just to cut down the search space. Are creates susceptible to displacement attacks? Absolutely. But because we think they're unlikely to occur in practice, we just punt on that one. All right, and finally, it's there are some rare situations where you can get false positives. So first of all, Manticore has this feature called unsound symbolication. Now what this is this turns the output of certain hash functions into free variables. This is a very useful feature because this can allow Manticore to search parts of that search tree that otherwise would not be able to search. The problem, though, is that when unsound symbolication is enabled and the detector is used, unsound symbolication can cause the detector to believe that a contract is vulnerable to a transaction displacement attack when that contract is actually properly protected by a commit reveal scheme. So roughly speaking, what winds up happening is that Manticore believes that a hash collision is possible in regard to a committed to value, when in practice, no such collision would be possible. All right, second, I'm going to use this false positive in air quotes here. So not every situation where a legitimate transaction would revert following fraudulent one is necessarily worth fixing. And I'm going to show you a real world example here. So the Golem network token, this is an ERC20 token, if you're familiar with that, which was, they had an ICO a few years ago. So this network token has this function finalize. So the way this works is, so I find this a little bit easier to reason about if you think about the negation of these conditions here. So what is necessary for us to get through these conditions? Well, it has to be the case that we are still in our initial funding round. It has to be the case that one of two conditions is true. Either we've reached some number of tokens, token creation cap, or we've reached some minimum number of tokens and some sufficient amount of time has passed. So when those conditions are met, we set the funding flag to false. Now you'll notice that once the funding flag has been set to false, you can no longer call finalize. It will revert after that. So presumably, the owners of this contract intended to call finalize themselves. But in theory, a malicious miner could swoop in and call finalize on their behalf. The thing is that the downside of this would be minimal. So it would cost the owner some gas. It wouldn't really gain the miner anything. But nonetheless, this function does have this property that that you could call it ahead of a legitimate transaction and then have the legitimate transaction revert as a result. So this is flagged by the detector. It's expected behavior, but in some sense, it is a real world false positive because the negative effects are minimal. Okay, so we've implemented a prototype of this. It is in this pull request, which I've depicted here. You are welcome to download it, try it, use it. You can comment on it on GitHub, or you can email me directly if you prefer. I would like to end with a shout out to the Manticore team for having created a platform which is really great for experimenting with ideas like this. And with that, are there any questions?
So Sam, oh, perfect. Sorry. Wade asked a question. What was the U in the context of your slide, Sam?
Okay, so so U is a transaction. It is a successful transaction that we now want to see if we can insert another transaction prior to, so as to then cause the transaction U to revert. So again, the idea is that we're looking for transactions such that if we insert some other transaction prior to it, we can cause that transaction to revert, and we do that search using symbolic execution.
So Sam, the thing I was going to ask it, especially in light of Christopher's talk right before this, is I think, as we all know, symbolic execution can be very, very difficult to use, or you have to actually know quite a bit about your search space and about your program that you're working on here. How, and I know this is something, since I'm technically your boss, I know you work on these sorts of things, but how has this helped your workloads and or the sorts of things that you might be doing when you're working with clients and using Manticore for those sorts of things?
Okay, so I want to emphasize that this is a work in progress. We consider this active research. We're still looking for ways to improve it, and in particular ways to speed it up. But I think the direct answer to your question is it's another tool in our toolbox, so that when a client comes to us with a contract and says, you know, could you look for vulnerabilities in this? This is one more analysis that we could apply to it. That is, we could possibly find opportunities where someone could conduct a transaction displacement attack against this contract that a client brings to us.
And that's perfect. Thank you, Sam. And Ilya asked, are there any anecdotes or interesting findings in any ERC 721s or NFT implementations that you'd be willing to share?
No, I'm not sure that I have applied it to any ERC 721 contracts yet. Yeah, so yeah, sorry, I don't have anything right now because I don't think I've actually done those experiments yet. So, no. So to a certain extent, because it is still a work in progress, we're still making sure we get the expected behavior on constructed examples. So that Golem token was a real world contract I happen to have lying around, and that result was actually unexpected. But by and large, we're still making sure that we get the behavior we expect out of examples that we construct.
But the Golem token that you showed earlier was a real world example that you were able to work with using
yes.
Yeah. Is that code anywhere that folks can look at as well? The token code, I mean.
It's available on Etherscan. I don't have it. I would have to get it from Etherscan. We can certainly obtain it. I can update my slides to make it easily linkable.
Yeah, we can add a link to that so that folks might want to look at that and see and understand the talk there based on that. Does anyone else have any other questions for Sam? And even if you think of something afterwards, you can reach out to us. We'll also, obviously, Empire Slacking, our Slack is open, and you can also reach out to us via email or Twitter if you do think of other questions. But otherwise, I think it's back to you, Anna. Sam, thank you so much.
Sure. Thank you, Sam. Thank you, Chris. I mean, I just wanted to say thank you to the speakers and to everybody that attended. Yeah, thank you. Our August Empire Hacking is going to be filled with lots of interns. If you have interns that you'd like to send our way, you can contact me through Meetup or Twitter, the Empire Hacking Twitter, or the Empire Hacking Slack. Yeah, some of us will just hang out for another 5-10 minutes, so feel free to stick around, ask some more questions. Other than that, thanks so much, and have a lovely evening.